We've learned so many things during the COVID pandemic. We have the opportunity to be so much better prepared for the next pandemic than we were for this one. All we need to do is exactly the opposite of what we did this time. Step number one in things not to do, copy the Chinese. Prior to COVID, if you were to examine emergency response plans completed by countries in the developed world, some for much worse pandemics than COVID is turning out to be, you know how many times you would have seen lockdowns mentioned? Zero. Zero. It was taken as a given that the real-world consequences of shutting down the economy of the entire world would outweigh the benefits. As mentioned later, we are now revising history to imply that the possibility of lockdowns was somehow missed. As stupid as our leaders are, I can tell you, it was not missed. It was discarded, and it should have stayed that way. But when the lockdown dominoes started to fall, you know how much consideration was given to the fallout of shutting down the economy of the entire world? Zero. Zero. Almost every country in the world immediately adopted the Chinese Communist Party's solution of locking people in their homes and throwing away the key until some bureaucrat thought it was safe to come out. But what's next? A one-child policy for the European Union? The worst offender here has to be the formerly free country of Australia, which is wisely pushing back against overt moves by China to establish its power in the Pacific region. But at the same time, it fell headlong into a totalitarian trap of increasingly crazy lockdowns. It's only just now waking up because you see, if just one life is saved from death by COVID, the many more numerous deaths caused by the lockdowns will have been worth it. Step number 2, create a decision pole. You've heard of the decision tree, probably. The idea is to take certain actions based on rational observations of unfolding events or findings. During COVID, our decision path consisted of a tree with no branches. In most of the world, there was literally no consideration given to any pandemic response that did not include government-imposed mandatory lockdowns. This is incredible. At this time in history, we have better capabilities for examining various complex alternatives than we have ever had in the history of the world. We have and had right in front of our eyes a treasure trove of relevant data that could have been examined in a matter of days in order to at least try to determine the pluses and minuses of various pandemic approaches. We collectively made a conscious decision not to do that. And the only possible explanation for that decision must be that our leaders did not want to know the information that would come out of these analyses, fearing that it would call the wisdom of the lockdowns into question and possibly undermine their ability to implement them. It was much more important to our leaders to have quick compliance than it was to make a decision based on statistics, logic, and reason. Step 3, stop thinking. After having implemented the lockdowns without really giving any serious thought to the downsides, it became very important to squash any debate about the wisdom of the lockdowns. At this point, the censor brothers shifted into high gear to try to block any discussion that did not agree with the government narrative. We started to hear the word misinformation attached to a range of ideas that in the past would have been considered reasonable debate. Now think about this for a minute. Doesn't rational thinking include, by definition, the consideration of misinformation in order to determine which information is accurate? Does scientifically valid information pop out of thin air, already fully developed and considered? People who had absolutely no justification to do so started determining when the line between scientifically valid information and misinformation was crossed. And they did this with a clear political agenda. Step number 4, rewrite history. Having taken a totalitarian approach to managing this pandemic, refusing to give serious consideration to any other alternatives, and then shutting down debate once this plan was implemented, it became important to make sure that any future discussion of lockdowns was framed in a positive light. The economic collapse, which occurred immediately after the lockdowns, became known as the pandemic recession. The ensuing inflation was due to bottlenecks in the supply chain caused by the pandemic. A quick question. If the lockdowns were not the cause of the recession, why was there no recession and, in fact, normal economic growth during the much more deadly Delta variant when lockdowns were scarce? Economics 101, folks, you'll find the economy tends to do a lot better when business owners are not threatened with jail time for doing business and workers are not confined to their homes. Step 5, kill the golden goose. One of the very few positive things that came out of COVID, in my opinion, was the quick development of effective vaccines to combat it. Now, obviously, people need to make their own decisions about whether the vaccine is a good decision for them, but it's good to have the option out there. Having developed these vaccines in record time, obviously, the first thing to do is to make sure that we punish the companies that made them. I'm sure it's just a coincidence that the vaccine developed in the most restrictive economy was the least effective, and the vaccine that was developed in the more free economy was late to be delivered, and the vaccine developed in the most free economy in the world proved to be the most effective and timely. And by the way, be careful what you hear about drugs being developed in other countries. The pharmaceutical companies in the developed world all make an outsized portion of their profits from the relatively free healthcare market in the United States, allowing them to at least stay in the race when it comes to developing high-quality medicines. So what we really need to do is make sure that the innovation facilitated by the relatively free U.S. market is regulated into oblivion. Considering all these obvious lessons, what a relief to know that our leaders are certain to do an objective and rational examination of what didn't work during COVID so that they can avoid making the same mistakes in the future. But because, if they didn't do that, we could all be in a heck of a lot of trouble.